Is it possible to turn this pandemic year into a nonfiction thriller? If anyone can, it's Michael Lewis. He joins us this week to talk about his new book, The Premonition. How did Juneteenth evolve in Texas, and should it be a national holiday? Historian Annette Gordon-Reed will be here to discuss her new book on Juneteenth. Alexandra Alter will be here with the latest in publishing news. Plus, our critics will talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's May 7th. I'm Pamela Paul. Michael Lewis joins us now from Berkeley, California, a repeat guest. He is here to talk about his new book, The Premonition, A Pandemic Story. Michael, welcome back to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
So we spoke not so long ago about your last book, The Fifth Risk, which was all about risk. Surely a global pandemic was one of those risks. What did you learn from reporting that book that maybe informed this book?
Yeah, it didn't just inform this book. It led to this book. The premise of The Fifth Risk was that stop thinking about the federal government however you think about it, if you think about it, and think about it as a manager of a portfolio of risks, many of them existential, that has been left to degrade. And under the Trump administration was actually kind of bashed around the head a bunch. And one of those risks is the risk of pandemic disease. The fifth risk was asking the question, what happens if people neglect these risks? And actually spent more of the time just pointing out the risks that I, for one, didn't really know existed, that you could go into any department, any agency in the government, the Commerce Department, the Agriculture Department, these departments that you think maybe they don't do very much, and find just terrifying things they're managing. So when I was thinking about what bad might happen that the government might mismanage, pandemics were on that list. But I thought it was, I gotta tell you, I thought it was such an obvious risk that that's not one that I want to write about in The Fifth Risk because surely they're managing that.
But here's the thing that you point out early in your book. You say that the U.S. was supposedly the most prepared among all countries around the world to face a pandemic. There was a big study that was conducted. So my question, I guess, is in part, obviously that study was wrong, but was it because of some of the things you wrote about in The Fifth Risk, things that happened under the Trump administration, or was the study flawed to begin with?
The study was done by the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and it was done really on the eve of the pandemic, like mid 2019. And it was laying out and ranking all the countries in the world by their pandemic preparedness. When you look at it, they're assessing as sort of the tools and resources a country had. And the United States and the UK were 1 and 2. And there were a whole bunch of reasons for this. But it turned out that what they were measuring was clearly very different from how you're going to do in the response, how are you going to do when the pandemic actually happens. It was a little bit like if you went into a college football team and assessed the talent of all the athletes to make a judgment about how they were going to do that season. But then the game gets played and you find that the team is horribly coached or the quarterback gets hurt or all kinds of things happen in battle you just can't plan for. And there was this huge disconnect between what this study suggested and what actually happened, because not just the United States, the UK performed very badly. And so the question was why? What's not in that study? And one very clear thing is the capacity of the society to organize its resources, that just its management ability, that the wrong people were in the wrong place and we didn't have the ability to move them to the right place. So, the study rightly kind of sensing that we have the right people. My God, we invented the notion of pandemic response. We wrote the playbook that it was shared with the rest of the world. The people who did that are alive and well and waiting to serve, but we didn't access them. I accessed them for my story. I got to write the book about the people who should have been running the thing rather than the people who did run the thing. That's, I would think, number one, a kind of lack of understanding and respect for the talent we have and an inability to organize it.
Before I get on to the heroes of this narrative, of which there are, I think, 3 central characters you focus on, I just want to talk about the people that one might think are the bad guys in this narrative, the what went wrong people and why. And you quote one character as saying, Trump was the comorbidity. What does that mean? Do you agree with that assessment?
It was one of these characters, one of these doctors said that. He said, Look, you can see the seeds of the response to this pandemic in not just the Trump administration, but what had happened before the Trump administration. It wasn't just Trump. Trump made everything worse, but there'd been changes in the American government, and changes in particular at the CDC, that made them less and less capable of actually controlling disease, and more like a fine academic institution that came in after the battle and tried to assess what had happened, but not equipped for actual battlefield command. The book doesn't get to the pandemic till like page 160. The backstory tells you how the story is going to play out. And in the backstory, we have episode after episode of people actually fighting disease on the ground, not COVID. It's tuberculosis or it's hepatitis C or it's whatever it is, and trying to work with the CDC and being immensely frustrated by the CDC's cowardice, unwillingness to engage, tendency to make everything more difficult, fear of bad publicity, one thing after another, that it was not really set up to be a brave institution. The bravery had been leached out of it over decades, going back to the Reagan administration. And so when bravery was called for, it was unable to generate it.
When you talk about the bravery leaching out of it over decades and under Reagan, are you talking about AIDS crisis, or is this in reference to just defunding? What happened then?
The original thing goes back to the Ford administration, where the CDC made a mistake. And it was a mistake of outcome rather than process. I think they did exactly what they should have done, but it turned out badly. There was a pandemic scare in 1976. It was of swine flu. There was an outbreak in New Jersey. A soldier died. The details of it are too complicated to go into here, but the experts all agreed that there was a serious threat that lots of Americans were going to die in the fall unless everybody got vaccinated. And the CDC pushed this. I mean, the CDC director, a man named David Sensor, pushed this hard, and in retrospect seemed to give President Ford no choice but to go forward with a vaccination program. The vaccine killed a few people, made a few other people sick, and the swine flu never came. Sensor, who had been running the CDC for more than a decade at that point, was made the scapegoat for what was actually an intelligent response. It was the smart thing to have done. It happened not to have worked out. And not long thereafter, during the Reagan administration, the CDC director was transformed from a career civil servant who could serve for, a decade or more, and who arose through his own virtues out of his own ranks, to a presidential appointee who was naturally selected from the pool of people who the president approved of politically, and who was on a much shorter leash. And if he did anything to displease the president, he was much, much easier to fire. And the institution got politicized in a way it had not before. Now, in the middle of all that, yes, AIDS research played a part. Money issues played a part. The CDC did some unpopular research about the effect of aspirin on children, showing that it in some cases gave rise to small children, a rare disease, and the aspirin manufacturers pressured the White House to shut down the research. Essentially, the scientific project that was the CDC, whenever it came afoul of the politics inside the Reagan administration, annoyed the Reagan administration so much that they decided to politicize the job. So ever since, what have we had? We've had a different kind of management in the CDC. And it isn't just the CDC. This has gone on across the government. Instead of people who were there managing for the long term, because they know they're going to be living in this house for 10 or 15 years that they're running, they're renters. They're there for 18 months, 2 years. They're focused much more on the short term and much more on pleasing the administration, not getting their names in the paper in the wrong way, all that stuff, instead of long-term management with a sense of job security. And I think you want to trace the beginning of the CDC's descent into a defensive crouch whenever anything controversial happens. It begins there.
You're talking about the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, and in the fifth risk, you were talking about things like the Department of Agriculture. And these are not inherently interesting subjects. So
Thank you, Pamela.
And I already confessed to you that I find finance boring, although I don't find your books on finance to be boring. So I want to mention something that Adam McKay said recently in an interview with the New York Times Magazine. That was a very nice thing about you. And I know that you two are friends and obviously work together. He's, of course, a Hollywood film director and television director, and he directed The Big Short, the adaptation of your book. And he said, "Why is Michael Lewis so good at those stories? He does two things. Number one, We all love the taste of making a lot of money. We can't resist it. The other thing we all love is knowing things that we're not supposed to know. Michael Lewis did both those things in The Big Short. He tells me things when I'm reading that book that most people don't tell me because they think I'm going to be bored. But Michael Lewis leans in and says, most people are bored by this. But if you really want to know what's going on, here's what it is. It's exhilarating. But I think he's right. And with The Fifth Risk, that was certainly true. Less so with this story, in a way. I'm curious if this was a different kind of challenge because the pandemic is inherently exciting and interesting and terrifying as a subject. It's also one, though, that we're all living. So we all know about it firsthand in many ways. And I'm curious if that formed a different kind of challenge to you as a writer.
It did, but it was solved instantly by the approach I was taking going into it. It was accidental how well it turned out because going into the pandemic, I had another book I was working on or about to start working on. And that book, it was starting as no book of mine had ever started, just with a character. I was so interested in the character. I didn't know what was going to happen to him. He was in a new situation. I was just going to follow him. And I knew the character was so good. He would create story. He would create what I needed to write a book. And I was going to take that leap. And so I was in that state of mind when the pandemic hit. And I was thinking character. And I had a character who I'd met 5 years before named Joe C.D.C., who's a biochemist at the UCSF, who ends up being one of the main characters in the Premonition, who I knew was a spectacular character. And I thought, I bet I can do the same thing with the pandemic that I was about to do with this other subject. I bet if I just trust character and find the right characters, the rest will take care of itself. So I wasn't so much thinking about what the backdrop was. Is it the financial crisis? With The Big Short, I was foregrounding the event. In this case, I was almost backgrounding the event and looking for the right people. And I got incredibly lucky in finding the three people I found, particularly Charity Dean, who's the woman who's at the center of the story.
I want to talk about those three. You have a biochemist, you have a public health worker, you have a federal government employee. Let's start with Charity, who say is the central character.
So anybody who's read Tara Westover's Educated knows a bit of Charity Dean's story. She grew up in that environment. She grew up in an environment in which girls weren't supposed to go get educated. They were supposed to have babies and go to church. And early on in her life, she becomes, partly because the church talks about the plagues that are coming, and missionaries come from Africa. She gets really interested in Africa and disease. I mean, I'm like in the second and the third grade when she's little. And she becomes obsessed with viruses and wants to get an education and claws her way out of her condition to get an education, gets a master's in public health and a medical degree. And this is when she's in her 20s. She thinks, one day I'm going to have to confront a pandemic. One day I'm going to get myself in a position where I'm the person making a decision that will save the country. She has a kind of grandiosity about her. At the same time, the whole world does not share that grandiosity. And there are twists and turns to it, but she finds her calling when she is named public health officer of Santa Barbara County. And that job, which is the job of the C.D.C., but on the ground version of the C.D.C., controlling disease so people don't die in Santa Barbara County. On that job, she discovers that she is required to be brave in ways that she never expected would have to be brave. Life and death decisions routinely, that any one of them will cost her reputation and her career if she makes the wrong one. Never mind exposing herself to the diseases that are killing people. And she develops bravery as a kind of muscle. And she does it on top of a infrastructure, a kind of psychological infrastructure that is rife with fear. She has all these fears from how she was raised. And the person I meet, when I first met her, I went to her house and she was in Sacramento at the time. She was when I meet her, she's second in command for the state of California in the public health department. But when I went to her house the first time, I noticed she had all these either sayings that were framed or little Post-it notes on her computer, and the books on her bookshelves, all one way or another, had to do with bravery, how to be brave. She kind of had to remind herself. She's full of fear, but she can't acknowledge the fear if she's going to do her job. And I swear to God, I've met the bravest person I've ever met in my life. The things you have to read the book to get the story, but she what she did to try to save the people of Santa Barbara, but also to try to mitigate the damage in California was just very impressive. And everyone who meets her, including very fancy people, are kind of in awe of her. She is the person through whom I tell the story of an attempt and failure to control the virus. She's the reason for the title of the book. She explained to me quite early, all the characters understand this, that when you're dealing with something like COVID, you have to be almost clairvoyant. You have to have a sixth sense, because by the time the disease shows itself in your community in the form of obvious illness and death, it's already widespread. You're looking in the rearview mirror. You're looking at infections that took place a month ago, and the thing is replicated since then exponentially. So you have to have this kind of nose for when it's appearing. You have to be able to see around corners. You have to have premonitions about it. So the second time I go see Charity Dean in her house in Sacramento, I was so taken by all the messaging she had for herself around her house, but I was only in the kind of public spaces of the house the first time. I said, could you do me a favor? Could you go out back with your sons and let me just loosen the house? Let me just wander and see what else you've got in here. And I want to look at everything. And she kind of looked at me strangely and she said, okay. So I went upstairs to her bedroom, opened like the cabinets in the bathroom, filled with little memos to herself. But I get to a picture of her grandmother. It's an old picture. It looks like it could be her great-great-grandmother. And she had mentioned to me the first few hours we'd spent together on the first visit that every year in December on her birthday, she sat down and wrote her resolutions for the coming year in her journal and then transcribed them on the back of her grandmother's photo. So I said, this must be the photo. So I took it off the wall. She said I could look at anything. I did feel a little sneaky. And there were her resolutions going back 15 years. And they were quite personal. They were all the kind of things you put in your New Year's resolutions. It was like learn French, lose 5 pounds, whatever it is. But for 2019, the first thing was something that was extremely personal. Number 2 said, it has started. I kind of opened the window and shouted down to her. I said, come up here. What is this? And she said, I had this tingle on my birthday, December 20th, 2019, that something was in the air, that the thing I'd been waiting for was coming. Nobody knew on December 20th.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, like, what was happening in Wuhan then?
No one knew. The first breath of this, the first news of this is early January. She's 2 weeks ahead of the CDC and the WHO talking about it. If you were a savant of disease in Wuhan, you would have detected something on December 20th, but she wasn't in Wuhan. And so this was just out of the blue. And what struck me about this was there was nothing on this back of this picture that was anything like this, like a prediction. Was that, well, 1, this is creepy. 2, it's similar to what she's described doing on the ground in Santa Barbara County in response to other kinds of diseases, kind of smelling things out before they're a big problem. But 3, the biggest thing was she found nothing remarkable about it. She thought, yeah, I sensed it. I sensed it and I can't tell you why. And I sensed it to the extent that I wrote that down. And she wasn't at all impressed with herself. So this character gripped me. And she ends up being not just, I was saying how you could just take a character. It was starting with character, all these other things happened that just solved all my literary problems. She unifies all the other characters. I follow her and she leads me to everybody else.
All right, I have to stop and talk a little bit about methodology because I'm curious if this is a tactic of yours, if you do this with every source, that you ask permission to sort of be let loose in the house and to look at anything you want, and if that works, or if you just tried that out for the first time here.
You can't be creepy, right? So it sounds a little creepy the way I described it, but it has to come out of the flow of the relationship. And I do, in fact, do this with subjects when it seems important. I don't ask as a rule to just wander around their house, but if wandering around their house seems all of a sudden really, really important, I ask. And in this case, I felt wandering around her house was extremely important, that I was going to learn all kinds of things about her that was going to take me a lot longer to learn otherwise. And at that point, I had explained to her what I was up to. I mean, I explained that I'm trying to figure out the meaning of you and the meaning of this experience. And I don't know what it is yet. And it's going to be a little bit of an odd experience. She didn't have much experience with journalists. As a public figure, she did. So, she'd been at press conferences. But this kind of thing was completely novel to her. And so she had to just trust me. And I basically said that. I said, you're basically going to have to trust me if this is going to be any good. And she did. She trusted me. The broader answer is that's what I'm often asking characters to do is trust me and let me in. Because if you don't let me in, I can't write about you. I wouldn't know how to do it unless you let me in.
All right, I'm going to leave it for listeners to discover the stories of the other two characters on their own by actually reading the book. But I want to ask one final question. Maybe it's because I just like this phrase so much. You call this book an unholy mix of obligation and opportunism. How so?
I say it began with an unholy mix of obligation and opportunism. It began in an unholy way. Like it should never have ended up as well as it did because, okay, I, Michael Lewis, write a book called The Fifth Risk saying that something bad's going to happen because the Trump administration is mismanaging the federal government and we as a society pay no attention to it. A pandemic happens. It looks like, oh, you sort of predicted it. I didn't, but it's sort of like teed up as this is the thing. I've been waiting for this. Trump got lucky for 3 years and now he's not lucky. And now we're all going to see, we're going to have a case study from The Fifth Risk before our eyes and we're all going to live it. How could I not write that book? It was just both opportunism and obligation. Both are bad reasons to write a book. The way a book should start is you fall in love with some situation, some story, some person. You don't go looking for the book and find it. So it was just fortunate that I found it.
All right. Well, I'm going to amend my question then and say it began as an unholy mix of obligation and opportunism, but I will end it with describing it as a character-driven thriller based on real life and the secret stories behind the pandemic that none of us know about, but we'll all know after we read it.
That sounds
Is
great.
That better?
That's pretty good.
All right. It was a little wordy. I'm sure you wrote it better. Michael, thank you so much for being on the podcast again.
All right, Pamela.
Michael Lewis's new book is called The Premonition, A Pandemic Story. Joining us now to celebrate 125 years of the New York Times Book Review, Tina Jordan. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So I'm going to bring you what I think is a very fun story today, part news and part gossip. And it unfolded not only in the pages of the book review, but in the main section, the A section of the Times itself. And this was in 1971. And let me read you this lead. Eric Siegel's love story, one of the most extraordinary book and movie successes in recent years, has been thrown out as a candidate for the coveted Fiction Award of the National Book Committee after the entire 5-member jury threatened to resign. The chair of the committee, as it turns out, was William Styron, and he told the book review, "It is a banal book which simply doesn't qualify as literature." So then I'm wondering, how does it end up as a nominee? Why are they all threatening to quit? But it turns out that back then, the National Book Foundation, I think they were called the National Book Committee then, they polled 500 librarians and critics and other book people and came up with a list of 5 nominees from that crowdsourced list. Now, judges were each allowed to add 1 book of their own choosing for consideration. So obviously Love Story came in as one of the 5 books that the committee had nominated. And the beleaguered head of the National Book Foundation just told the Times, "It's true that Love Story is no longer on the list before the fiction panel, but I'm not going to make any further comment."
Wow.
So then there are some details about a very heated meeting of the fiction committee. And I'm like, this is a lot of insider detail that we're learning. Well, guess who one of the members of the fiction panel was?
Someone from the New York Times?
Yes, it was John Leonard, the book review editor.
Well, we don't allow that anymore, we should say.
Right, we don't allow it. So Styron tells the Times, "We were going to resign if the National Book Committee insisted upon keeping Love Story on the list." At first, Peter Jennison, that's the head of the National Book Foundation, was adamant that we should abide by the rules, but when he saw that we were equally passionate and meant business, he agreed to remove the book. Of course, they then went to the publisher. It was Harper and Row for comment, the publisher of Love Story, and the publisher just said, "Look, the fact that we have 500,000 copies in print suggests the public has made its own choice."
We love a literary scandal.
We do, but I'm going to give you a quick quiz. So the other books on the list were Mr. Samler's Planet by Saul Bellow, Deliverance by James Dickey, Beck, a book by John Updike, Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion. What do you think won the National Book Award, Pamela?
Oh, I'm going to be wrong.
I was wrong when I guessed.
Play it as it leaves?
That's what I picked, honestly, and what I wish had won, but no, it was the Saul Bellow.
Interesting. Not even one of the major Saul Bellows.
Right?
All right, bring us more scandals, Tina, next time. Thanks.
Will do.
Joining us now, Annette Gordon-Reed. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University, and author, most recently, of this new book, On Juneteenth. Annette, thanks for being here.
Thanks for asking me.
What inspired you to write this book now?
Well, my editor, Bob Weil, has been after me to write a book about Texas for many years. And we were thinking about a big book where I would talk about the history of slavery in Texas, something that people don't think about very much because it was new to the Confederacy and didn't exist a long time as a state. But this past summer, after I did a piece in the New Yorker about Juneteenth, I started thinking about doing something more. And Bob, who hadn't actually read the New Yorker piece yet, had the same idea because there was so much talk about Juneteenth at that time. And he said, well, how about doing something that's a smaller book? And it is much smaller than the last big book I did. And that's how I decided to do it. So sitting here in the middle of Manhattan in the pandemic, I set about to write about the history of Texas, but also the history of my family to some degree. So it was it was a product of something that had been cooking a long time. I actually found, while cleaning out a closet, an essay that I had done that could be a precursor to the first chapter of this book, actually the second chapter of the book, and that I'd written maybe 10 years ago. So it's something that's a long time in the making, but just decided to pull the trigger at this point.
I mean, it is quite different from previous books that you've done insofar as it is short.
No, sure.
How was that, not having to toil away for years at a history?
It was fun because, when I was growing up, I always wanted to be a writer. And this is a departure for me, but it is actually the kind of writing that I always thought that I would be doing when I was growing up, dreaming about being a writer, that I would write essays. I've always been a great admirer of James Baldwin, and Gore Vidal's essays I thought were wonderful, better than the novels. And that's the kind of thing that I wanted to do. So it was sort of a dream come true for me to be able to take this form and talk about some things that were very important to me.
What about the memoir aspect? Was that an easy thing for you to do or a little bit more difficult to delve into your own history?
More difficult. My co-author, Peter Onuf, he always reads the manuscripts that I write, and he read this one. He said, well, you're more open. You're talking about yourself, but you're open in an Annette Gordon-Reedy kind of way, meaning it's not, I'm not spilling my guts or anything like that, but I'm talking about myself, which I don't typically do in my work. And historians are, we're writing about people long dead and away from us, and that's not what we typically do. So it took a lot for me to think about how much I wanted to reveal and how personal I actually wanted to be. But I enjoyed it. I actually did have a good time.
You're also making choices, obviously, about what to include and what not to include, what's important, what's
Absolutely.
not important. But this is a different kind of decision-making in terms of what to put in and what to leave out.
Yeah, I can't reveal myself without talking about my family and other people in my life. And that's one of the things that I've always felt reticent about with memoir in the memoir form is, did all these people agree
Yes.
to be dragged into this? I mean, novelists hide it, and sometimes not very well, but at least you have the cover of fiction. And so I'm very reticent about, not because there's anything to be ashamed of or anything like that. It's just that this is my work, and how do people get dragged into things that they didn't decide to do? So I try to be revealing and just enough to give a flavor of what I'm talking about, to be real and to be truthful, but not give extraneous details that drag people into a project that they never consented to.
All right. Well, I'm going to drag some people in a little bit. Let's talk about some of that family history in Texas. How long has your family been in Texas?
Well, as far as I've been able to determine, looking at Ancestry.com and from family stories, on my mother's side, at least from the 1820s, which would have been before the Texas Republic and certainly before Texas became a part of the Union. On my father's side, from the 1860s, as near as I've been able to tell. And all of them were brought over. These were enslaved people brought over by enslavers who had lived in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, as far as I've been able to tell. And these roots go back very, very deep. So I feel this connection to Texas, and most of my family is still there now, that is very, very deep and important.
Did you grow up knowing all of this family history?
I grew up knowing some of it. Some of the things I found during the course of tentative researching over the past summer, working on the book. But I knew about the ancestors who came from Alabama and Georgia, where we would have said, my great-grandmother would have said, where their people came from as a child growing up. Yes.
You write in your book that it was drummed into you from an early age that as a Texan, you inhabited a unique place that you were always meant to claim. What exactly is that idea, and how is it made clear?
Well, it's made clear in 2 years of Texas history that we had in the 4th and the 7th grade. It's made clear in the Texas flag everywhere. It's made clear in commercials, everything. It's very much drummed in that Texas is supposed to be this special place. And it annoys people on the outside. I often say when I meet Texans, when you meet people who are from Texas, you know pretty early on that they're from Texas because they tell you. And I don't find that as much with other states. And I know that it's possible that it probably does happen, but Texans are very vociferous about their backgrounds. And so it comes in the sort of culture, the everyday culture.
How much of that was drummed into you as a student for 2 years in school, how much of that version of Texas was reflective of Black Texas? Did it feel like your Texas?
It felt like my Texas, but it wasn't specifically about Blacks. I mean, we talked a little bit about slavery, but that was always a very uncomfortable subject. Texans focused much more on the Texas part of the legacy, but Texas devoid of plantation slavery. I think I saw maybe the Confederate flag I have a vague memory of it being on the courthouse square, but then it went away and it was the Texas flag. And it's not until recently, went back to Texas a couple of years ago and took a trip through the countryside, and I saw more Confederate flags then than I ever saw growing up. So growing up, the emphasis really was on Texas, but Texas as cowboys, Texans as this independent group of people, but we never really said what prompted that desire for independence, which, as I have learned, was slavery.
Why did your parents switch you from the school where your mother taught to another one in first grade? And what year did this take place?
This was 1964. My parents switched me from Booker T. Washington School to Anderson Elementary School because I was going into the first grade, and they thought that the courts were going to strike down the freedom of choice plan that had been put in place. Freedom of choice was a way of circumventing Brown. This was 10 years after Brown, and they were still trying to find ways to get around it. And the idea was that white parents would choose white schools and Black parents would choose Black schools. My parents thought that this was going to be struck down. And since I was starting school really with first grade, full day school, that I should be in place for when this happened. Now, it took 3 or 4 years for this to happen, but they knew it was going to happen. And I also think that there was certain idealism on their part. This was in the middle of the civil rights movement. You know, this is 1964. They're still passing laws and doing various things to get rid of de jure segregation. And I think even though they kind of denied it later on, there was a hopefulness about the future. And I was going to be in the vanguard of that. So that's why they sent me.
And what was the reality like for you being in that vanguard?
Well, it was tough. Some of the students, but the teachers all were very, very committed to making it work. And working on this book, it just occurred to me for the first time what may have been going on there with the teachers. I think there may have been sort of a reciprocal admiration, or the teachers at Anderson were very, very nice to me and very helpful to me because my mother was a teacher. I wonder if that did not figure into it as well, a sort of camaraderie there. But they were wonderful to me. Some of the students, not so much. And then on the other hand, I could tell that some of the students had parents who told them specifically to be nice to me. So I went through this period where there was some hostility on the part of some students, but there were also people who were very kind. I learned later on that there had been threats against our family, but I obviously wouldn't have been told about that. And a sense of pressure. My mother said I broke out in hives at one point. One of my relatives who lived in Houston, who was a very, very extravagant woman, went to the most ritzy department store in Houston, Sakowitz, and bought me a huge amount of clothes. So I would be dressed, to the nines. And so everybody saw it as a mission. And I had that sense that I was on some kind of mission, which is an interesting thing for a 6-year-old to feel.
Yes.
But I understood that something was important about this.
What about your friends from your old school, from kindergarten and your neighborhood? What did they think of the fact that you were sent off on this mission?
Sent off on this mission. My best friends were fine with it. There were other people who were not fine because they saw my mother and father's decision as perhaps a reflection on their attitude about the Black school. And it wasn't, because my two older brothers, remained at Washington School. This was just, I think, for my parents, as I said, some sort of idealistic notion that we were in a vanguard of something. And there were people who resented it. And I grew up being a kind of person in this town where people knew who I was. And some people liked the idea of what I had done. And there were some people who hated it. So I very often encountered people who wanted to beat me up. And I didn't know who they were. If somebody said, who is that person? And I had no idea, but they knew who I was. And I think I was a symbol to them of something that they had lost. And that was this really beloved school where the teachers were not only their teachers, but sometimes their relatives. They went to church together. They lived in the community together. And this broke apart in 1968 when the Supreme Court struck down the freedom of choice plans and everybody had to move to white schools. And they resented that tremendously and resented me. Some of them resented me for that reason.
You tie a number of threads together in this book, which I think describing it as a kind of extended essay is an interesting way to talk about it. So you have all of this memoir, but the title of the book is On Juneteenth. So I want to just shift to that for a moment and then talk about how these all come together. And let's start, for those who are not familiar with this holiday, what is Juneteenth?
Juneteenth celebrates the day that General Gordon Granger, came to Galveston, Texas, to announce that slavery was over. Appomattox had taken place earlier in April, but the Confederate Army of the Trans-Mississippi continued to fight. And in fact, the last battle of the Civil War, they actually won. It was in Texas. But they realized that there was no way to go on. And so they surrendered in June. And Granger is given orders to go to Galveston and which was at the time the most important city in Texas. It was a port city, the Galveston Island it actually is. And he made the announcement that slavery was over. And he issued the General Order Number 3, which not only says that slavery was over, but that enslaved people would then occupy an equal station with whites, which of course he didn't have to say. He could have just said slavery was over and that's it. But by saying that, it obviously buoyed the former enslaved people, but it also made the whites incredibly angry. And so it was this time of celebration, June 19th, 1865, a time of celebration, but it was also a time of a tremendous amount of violence as well, as whites retaliated against Blacks who celebrated. So from that day, Black people in Texas took to commemorating it. It was originally called Emancipation Day. And a group of men in Houston in the 1870s, Black men, bought land to create Emancipation Park, where Blacks could come and celebrate this day. And it eventually became a city park, a segregated city park, and it has remained in Houston. I actually went there as a child. and it was called Juneteenth. I haven't been able to figure out exactly when that came into the vernacular, but it's obviously a mashup of June 19th. And these were celebrations where you went to church. They started out mainly in churches, then they switched to parks, and then people had celebrations at their home. And as a kid, we celebrated by setting off firecrackers that my grandfather bought me and drinking red soda water, as we called it, which I don't find in the North very much, and barbecue.
What is red soda water?
It's strawberry soda pop.
Got it.
We call it soda water now, or Coke. Everything in Texas is a Coke, whatever it is. It's sort of like a family day celebration. And it was a jumping off point for July 4th. When I was growing up, Juneteenth was celebrated mainly by Black people, but then it became a state holiday. Now whites and Blacks celebrate it, and it's a big deal down there. And it's, as I said, originally for us, it was a way of commemorating the end of slavery. Or my father, who was somewhat sardonic, would say, well, the slaves have never been freed. But for the people who, like my great grandmother, whom I knew until I was about 11, it was a big deal. Her mother had been enslaved as a child and was freed as a child by her father and along with her mother. So she knew someone who had been enslaved. So this was not far in the past at all. And it was a meaningful celebration.
You mentioned earlier that this more recent proliferation of Confederate flags didn't exist as much when you were growing up, when it was more about the Texan flag, which seems to indicate that things are not necessarily getting better for Black people in Texas and for Texas overall in terms of its attitudes around race.
Well, I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, Houston has a Black mayor, Black city officials, a huge Black population. I think it's getting better politically because I think Texas might be transforming, and we keep waiting for it to turn purple, and it didn't turn purple the last time. But I do think that things are getting better, and I think that as evidence of that is the reaction. The voter suppression. There's a sense that people want to vote. I mean, people said that, Texas is not a red state. Texas is a voter suppressed state. And if we could get past that, and we'll see what happens in the next couple of years on this point, I think we can see some real viable changes. As the changes take place, people become more shrill and the reaction against these things become more intense, which I think is a sign of movement. People don't have to do that if they're secure, if they think it's all wrapped up. But I think Black Texans are on the move and are ready to play their part and take an even more significant role in the future of the state.
All right, one last question. Returning to Juneteenth, do you think that very Texan holiday should be turned into a national holiday?
I think it should be. I will admit, when I started writing this, that was not a goal. That was not something that I was thinking that much about. But since then, I can't think of a better time. I know that there's some people who say January 1st with the Emancipation Proclamation, but there is already a holiday on January 1st.
It's taken.
It's taken. If you don't want to set up a situation where you're always dissatisfied because people aren't paying enough attention to it, then you avoid that. December 1865 was the date slavery actually ended, because that was when the 13th Amendment was fully ratified. But there's another holiday around that time as well. And Juneteenth, the apparatus is already there. Practically every state has some kind of way of commemorating this. So yes, I think it should be. There should be a date to commemorate the end of slavery, even though, as my father, being as sardonic as he was talking about the fact that the end of slavery didn't end the problems for African Americans in Texas. It was important to people like my great-great-grandmother, people who had been enslaved. There was still a long road to travel, but the end of being treated as chattel, for their sake, there should be some kind of commemoration, and I think Juneteenth would be the perfect one.
Well, we shall end there. Brings us back to the title of your book. Annette, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Annette Gordon-Reed's new book is called On Juneteenth. Alexandra Alter joins us now with an update from the literary world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
So, 2 words, Blake Bailey.
Yes.
Tell us, what does this mean? What happened for those who may not have paid attention or still have questions?
So this has been a really huge story and controversy in the publishing world for a number of reasons. Blake Bailey recently came out with the first authorized biography of Philip Roth. It was a work that had been 10 years in the making. It was pretty highly anticipated. Philip Roth himself approved of Blake Bailey as his biographer and provided a ton of material for this book. So this was going to be the definitive life of Philip Roth. And shortly after it was released, a number of women came forward and accused Mr. Bailey some accused him of sexual assault, others of harassment and grooming and behaving inappropriately with his former students when he was an English teacher in New Orleans, an 8th grade English teacher. So it was quite a shocking story for many people who had known of his work and career, and he was a pretty esteemed literary biographer. And the fallout was pretty intense as well. And it kind of has become a bigger discussion, I think, in publishing about how do you handle scandals and controversies like this as a publisher. So his publisher, W.W. Norton, reacted pretty strongly. First, they said they were pausing shipments of the book, which meant they wouldn't be sending out new copies to retailers. They printed 50,000 copies. They had invested quite a bit in this book. And then about a week later, Norton told its employees that they were taking the book out of print, that they had basically severed the contract, that Mr. Bailey was free to take the book elsewhere if he wanted to get it published elsewhere. They also took his memoir out of print. So essentially they were saying we are no longer in business with this author. What's pretty unusual about this decision is that they were responding to a controversy that had nothing really to do with the content of the book. There were some critical reviews of the biography, but often when a publisher takes a book out of print, it's because there are really egregious factual inaccuracies in the book. There's accusations of plagiarism or fabrication, things that impact how readers will approach the work because the content is tainted in some way. And this was different. There have been other cases, pretty high profile ones. For example, Woody Allen's memoir, which Hachette was planning to publish, they dropped it when people internally and externally protested that they shouldn't be publishing a book by Woody Allen, given the accusations of sexual misconduct against him, which he has denied. There was another instance where Penguin was going to publish a book by Mark Halpern. He was accused of sexual misconduct, which he has denied, and they canceled that contract. But those books hadn't been published yet. So taking a book out of print is a pretty unusual and strong response to this kind of controversy. And there was a little bit of pushback. There were people like Suzanne Nossel, who's the chief executive of PEN America, which is a free speech organization. The quote that she gave to my colleague Jennifer Schuessler, who worked with me on a story about this, that she said, bringing out a book should signify that a publisher believes there's something edifying, worthwhile, or elucidating contained in the volume. It shouldn't be construed as an endorsement of the ideas or narrative pervade, nor the personal conduct of the author. So there are some people who are saying we can separate the work itself from the conduct of the author. And the other interesting question that's come up is, given that Blake Bailey worked so closely with Philip Roth and that Philip Roth was so invested in this book and he really helped us shape the narrative by providing a ton of material, the fact that that book is no longer widely available means that Philip Roth's own efforts to shape the narrative of his life have backfired. And so what will become of those papers? And will other biographers have a crack at the same material? And we don't know the answers to that yet.
Okay, I have a bunch of really basic questions. I'm going to start at the end and go back to the beginning. And the end story is, when we say that the book isn't available, does that mean you can't go on Amazon and get it? Does that mean that libraries that already have it are pulping it? Does that mean it's not available in an ebook format? What does it actually mean?
That's a great question. And it's a little hazy, but for now, there are still print copies floating around. You can purchase a print copy on Amazon, but the ebook was taken out of circulation and the audiobook was taken out of circulation. And I'm sure there are a handful of copies in libraries and in other physical bookstores, but it means they won't be printing any more copies. And since they paused shipping the ones that they already had in the warehouse and they canceled another planned printing, it's not going to be widely available. Particularly with the ebook having been taken down, it means that once these print copies run out, it won't be available anymore.
What about the paperback? Can Blake Bailey go and sell this to another publisher? Can he self-publish if he chose to do so?
He could self-publish and he could find a contract with another publisher. So that's not out of the question. I mean, often when a scandal of this magnitude erupts, it is tricky for another publisher to wade into the controversy. But it has happened recently. We had, after I mentioned Hachette dropped Woody Allen, the independent publisher Skyhorse picked up that book and put it out. After Simon & Schuster dropped Senator Josh Hawley, the conservative independent publisher Regnery picked up that book. So authors have had their contracts canceled and gone elsewhere and published their books. And Senator Hawley's book is selling pretty well on Amazon.
All right, I want to go back to the very beginning. You were talking about the accusations against Blake Bailey, and you said that he had been accused of sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior and rape. But another word you used might not be familiar to all listeners, which is grooming. What is meant by that?
So there was really a thorough report in Slate about Blake Bailey's behavior with his students at Lusher, which is a middle school in New Orleans. And grooming is an interesting term to unpack because I think in this context, it meant that Blake Bailey was gaining the trust of his students and forming relationships with them where he was acting as kind of a mentor. He kept in touch with a lot of his female students as they went through college and graduate school, would offer to write recommendation letters, and they would recommend him for prizes. And so there was like a deep kind of trust that a lot of them felt for him. And several of the women who I spoke to for the piece that I reported explained that it was a very complicated relationship. And so then when he would invite them to drinks or back to his hotel room, there was already this foundation of trust and admiration. And then in some cases, he would then make sexual advances on them and they felt very unprepared and they were unwelcome. And a lot of them felt afterwards that in some ways still wanted his approval. So it's a very, I think, traumatic experience on top of the assault charges. The women that I spoke to felt that they really had been manipulated and that the trust that they had put in this authority figure was violated.
There were also more serious and more recent allegations that came out during your reporting.
That's right. So in addition to behavior with his students, and I should say clearly to our listeners that Mr. Bailey has strenuously denied the allegations against him. And he and his lawyer have both said very firmly that they do not believe that he ever behaved in non-consensual ways with women, including his former students. But there have been more serious allegations. In our reporting, we learned that a publishing executive, Valentina Rice, had an encounter with Mr. Bailey, which occurred at the home of our own book critic, Dwight Garner, when they were both at a dinner party there. And later on in the evening, according to Miss Rice, Mr. Bailey assaulted her. And one thing that I should mention to our listeners too is that Valentina Rice, and this was in our reporting as well, under a pseudonym, using an anonymous email address, notified Norton, Mr. Bailey's publisher. He was already under contract for the Philip Roth biography, and notified them that she had been assaulted and that she thought they should know. And at the same time, she reached out to the New York Times, and the New York Times attempted to contact her, but didn't hear back. So this is a piece of the story I think that a lot of people in publishing were quite shocked by. She's a well-known publishing executive, and this was a more recent and I think a more serious accusation.
So just to jump in on the timeline for a moment, at that point, Valentina Rice agreed to talk to a Times reporter and eventually agreed to go on the record in our story.
That's right. Yeah, I think once she learned that there were other women who had been impacted and had encounters with Mr. Bailey, she felt it was important to go on the record as well.
Well, it feels like this story is not over because it seems like there remains a lot of questions about the future of this biography, Blake Bailey's future, the future of what comes of these allegations.
Yes, I think there are still many, many questions about Philip Roth's archives, Blake Bailey's future as a literary biographer who was quite well respected. His books are still available overseas. The UK edition is available for sale. His other earlier biographies are also still for sale. So there might be other developments.
I have the feeling you'll be back talking about this again, Alexandra. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now, John Williams and Paul Sagal to talk about the latest in literary criticism. Hey there.
Hey, Pamela.
John, you're not usually here for the critics segment, although on occasion, but usually not talking about a review that someone else wrote. This week you are. What's the book?
Yeah, I'm here on behalf of our colleague Jennifer Salai. She reviewed this week a book called Jackpot by Michael Mechanic. And the subtitle of the book is How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Mechanic is an editor at Mother Jones Magazine. The interesting thing about this book is that, as the subtitle says, the How Their Wealth Harms Us All won't surprise people because Mother Jones is a left-leaning magazine, and this is partly about a system that is broken in Mechanic's view in that it even allows people to get billions and billions of dollars for themselves and maintain it. But Mechanic asks us to empathize with the ultra-rich, and Jen has a very funny line to start the review. She says, "If you have ever wondered how the ultra-rich live, it turns out, are you ready for it? They live pretty well." And she questions whether or not it's really the 99%'s job to put themselves in the place of the top sliver of the 1% and think about, some of the more stressful things actually that come with ultra wealth. And she also wonders if, in the end, his idea is essentially to convince the ultra rich that it's much better for society as a whole and even for them to chip in a lot of their wealth to social. And this is interesting because we're talking the day after Joe Biden's big speech about about redistributing some of these resources to social goals. And so Jen thinks it's an interesting granular look at the problem, but wonders if Mechanic isn't trying to do something, she calls it a delicate balancing act, serving up the digestible morality tale of people spoiling themselves truly rotten before digging into the fibrous sociological knot of the system as a whole. And I think that she found the system part more convincing than the morality tale.
Let me take advantage for a moment of the unusual role you're playing here this week, John. Usually you talk about a book that you've either read or a book that you've reviewed, in which case you've also read it. This week you're coming here as the editor of a review that someone else wrote and of a book that someone else read. Can you just talk a little bit about the process of editing a book review?
Oh, no, I should leave. I don't want to hear this.
Carl, close your ears, Carl.
Oh, no.
We'll tell you when we're done. The process of editing a book review. Well, our three staff writers, as our listeners know, are very good at what they do. What they do is they file their reviews to me and I edit them for for sense and for facts. So I check to make sure that the things they're saying about the book are true, whether they're quoting from it or citing facts from them. And I try to make sure that their argument is what they want it to be. And so I'm in conversation with them as we edit it about things that do or don't serve that purpose. And with Jen, she reviews exclusively nonfiction, and a lot of it very argument-driven, political nonfiction, sociological nonfiction. And so with her, I think that's sort of the primary thing that we normally do. For instance, in a review like this, if I'm ever confused about what Mechanic is saying based on Jen's description or what she thinks of that argument, I'll just sort of gently have a conversation with her about it. But it's usually normally very small fixes and tightening things up that gets us there.
See, this would have been a very different conversation if Pearl hadn't been in the room. But since you're here, Pearl, what is this process that John describes as gentle? What is it like for you on your end?
It's so important. I mean, it's so fun and it's so important. So much of what we do is so solitary. And I mean, John is very modest as he describes what he does, but it really is, it's so fun to think alongside him about these pieces. And he edits for sense and fact, but also for style, also for where the book is sort of functioning in the broader world. I mean, it's really such a delight. And I learn a lot from John's edits, and I think all like the best editors make you better writers. And I think he definitely does that for all of us.
All right. Next time we'll have this conversation separately.
I'll tell you the truth.
Yes. That was lovely, both of you.
Also, he takes out my bad jokes, which I think is really, really, such a boon.
What book review did John edit for you this week?
John heroically edited my review of Alison Bechdel's new book, The Secret to Superhuman Strength. It is her third graphic novel. And, I'm an Alison Bechdel fanatic. I read everything she does. I'm just, I don't know, she's one of those writers who I think just sort of changed my life in a lot of ways in the kinds of ideas and the ideas in her graphic novels, the depiction, the way that she blends fact and fiction. And her latest, when you open it, immediately you're like, something is very different happening here. And it's in radiant color. And Bechtel doesn't do color. If you've read her books, Fun Home, she uses an occasional blue-green kind of wash. Her other book, Are You My Mother, has this spot color, this like dark, almost lipstick-looking accent. But this book is sort of like, in my review I write, it's like that scene when Dorothy opens the door in the Wizard of Oz, and suddenly you're just in this oversaturated world. And reading this book, like, okay, there's certain older obsessions coming through. Bechtel's always been interested in the body and has written about the fact that she's haired off in pursuit of every exercise fad her entire life. And the book is about exercise, and it's about this desire for transcendence, the desire to master the body, the desire to forget the body by either working compulsively or exercising compulsively. But it's also stylistically very different in the use of color and in the use of silence. And as I reviewed it, I really started to think about something Virginia Woolf once wrote after writing To the Lighthouse. And, Woolf was obsessed with her mother, obsessed with the death of her mother that happened in her teens. And she said, after writing this book, I'm no longer haunted by my mother. My mother no longer obsesses me. And with this book, this is Bechtel's third, I started to think about, she's written a book for each of her parents. Fun Home, in which she talks about the possible suicide of her father. Are You My Mother, in which she talks about her very remote mother. And it's a book really built of like sort of her conversations in therapy, trying to process this relationship. She's outlived both of her parents, and now she's written a book that's very, very different. It's in color, which feels salient because her father was a fanatic about color. He loved interior design. He didn't let Bechtel talk about color. He was so tyrannical about his feelings about all of this. And she found working in black and white such a kind of relief. But here, there's this book that's in color. It isn't really talking back at them. There's smaller presences in this book. She really turns to thinking about, again, exercise, her own body, but through that, her own mortality, through that, her own artistic process. Why has it been so painful? What is behind the way that she's worked in the book that she's written? And it really feels like, to me, it's a bit of a bridge. And I don't know the kinds of books that are going to come now, but I don't think that they're going to be written in the shadow of these two very charismatic, controlling people, her parents.
I have two questions about the visual element of this book. One is, many graphic novels, actually the color is done by someone else, not the person who does the line drawing and writes the text. Did she do the coloring herself?
For the first time, she had help. She had the help of her partner, a painter. And I suspect the painter, her partner got involved because Bechtel was running so late on her deadline. She's famously slow and exacting. And I wonder if her partner was conscripted to help hurry it up. And then it seems like they just built something together. The palette is so different and it feels so significant. It just feels so light, so bright, even though, the book has all of this trademark anxiety and worry. There's a real, something is being signaled in the color and the art here. I think that feels very profound and different.
And then the other question is about the challenge for you, if it is a challenge as a reviewer, or if it's something that's kind of exciting, which is writing about a book that is largely visual as much as it is text. It's about the pictures. And do you enjoy doing that? Is that a different muscle for you? Is it harder?
I don't know. I don't know if it feels different because I read so many graphic novels, and I really like photography and have written about photography. So I think for me, no, it doesn't feel different, but I think it does, especially in the case of graphic novels, sometimes there are two stories being told, and you're constantly jetting between the written and the image and seeing what's happening, what's contradicting, what's, how are they sort of flowing together. If anything, it gives me more to do, which I like.
That makes sense. I feel like the writing about the images and the palette it's not that it's a different muscle. It gives you something else to focus on than you're used to. So it's like a change of pace.
Yeah. And I think it's also, this is going to sound maybe, silly, but it's also emotional in a way that sometimes when you're reviewing a book, you can really just get lost in the argument and really get lost in the ideas. And there's something about the way that color works on you. And I think there's something about the way that graphic novels invite autobiography. And you have these artists who can't help but draw themselves as children. And there's something moving there. They're asking you to access them, know them in a different way, And I think, again, that maybe doesn't work a different part of my head, but maybe my heart a little bit. I got all sappy on you. I got so sappy. I don't know what's happening to me.
It was lovely. It was lovely. This was a very heartfelt episode. Next time we'll go for heartbreaking.
It's a very special episode of the Book Review podcast.
I know. Thank you for joining us for this extra special heartwarming edition. Let's run down the titles of the books that you each talked about again.
I talked about Jackpot, How the Ultra-Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All by Michael Mechanic.
And I reviewed The Secret to Superhuman Strength by Alison Bechdel.
Lovely talking to both of you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.